Adjust your webcam.
We're live.
Oh yeah, we do need to adjust the webcam.
Let me know if you need to stand somewhere else.
That looks good to me. And go.
All right, perfect. Hi everyone, Chris Caulfield. That's the name of the talk. I'm going to get right into it. So, I think the best way to start this is just to give you all a little bit of background about who I am so you understand my perspective on everything. So, I have a BS in computer science, graduated from IGDA Albany last May. That's my formal education, it's my bread and butter. But more than that, I've been a gamer all my life, ever since my dad showed me Super Mario Brothers when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, completely enthralled me. I don't have to explain to you guys what comes next. I'm sure a lot of you guys are all in that exact same boat. So, I founded my first company, Catapult Games, in July of 2017. We are a virtual reality game development company. And since that was my first professional venture into game development, I thought one of the best things to do to start off everything right was to dive in, study, examine everything. And since I am the game's lead designer, as I think I have a little blurb on there, I do a lot for my company. It's just how it is when you're a three-man team. I'm the game director. I come up with the ideas and the ultimate player experience and how that should be. I'm also the lead designer, so I implement and design the individual game systems, particular enemies, level layouts, blah, blah, blah. I also do the implementation. I do a lot of stuff. So I bring all of those perspectives with me for what I'm talking about. What I started mentioning is that since I was the lead designer for this project, I thought it would be very important for me to sort of learn the lay of the land of the VR scene. So I bought a bunch of VR games, I studied all of them, I took notes, I wrote up documents on all of them about what parts of these games I liked, what parts of these games I didn't like, but most importantly, why the parts of the games that I liked were good, and why the parts of the games that I thought were clunky felt clunky. I think that's a very important ability to have as a game designer. So that is a bit about me. And the next slide is just sort of front-loading everything with some terms, because it would be a nightmare if I had to use 2 sentences every single time any of these terms came up, so I'm just going to describe all of them right off the bat. Firstly, any of you that have ever used online chat rooms know what IRL means. That just distinguishes you, the human being playing the game, from you, the player character, in the game. And in VR, I need to make that distinction when I talk about the player or the player's hands, because there's your in-game hands and there's your IRL hands. So there we go, useful descriptor. By physically immersive, I mean that the actions that IRL you is performing line up with the physical actions that your in-game character is doing. For example, aiming and shooting a gun in a game like Super Hot, I would describe as physically immersive, because you feel something in your hand, there's a trigger on it, you pull that trigger to fire it, you aim it, you point it, physically immersive. Next term takes a little bit more description. If any of you don't know what the uncanny valley is, I probably should have put a picture of that up there. But the idea is, if you take something like a robot and you start giving it human characteristics like eyes, 2 arms, and 2 legs, it looks cute. And then as you make it look more human, it gets progressively more cute until you reach a point where it stops looking like a non-human with some cute human characteristics, and a human that looks like there's something seriously wrong with it, and it can look creepy or uncomfortable. And I've taken that concept of the uncanny valley and I apply it to other things in VR. So when I say the uncanny valley of something, I mean that your example has some of the key properties of that X, but also conspicuously lacks some of the other key properties of that X, and thus you aren't quite sure what to make of it. Flat games is an easy one. Since there never needed to be a term for a non-VR game that you play on a rectangular screen, someone had to make up a term for that. Like how, what's a good example of that? When ebooks came out, people had to start calling books print books, because now book was ambiguous. So since game is ambiguous, we have VR games and flat games. Lastly, artificial locomotion refers to any movement that takes place by your character in the game that is distinct from the actions that IRL you is doing. So for example, if you've ever played a VR game where you teleport or where you push the analog stick to walk around, that's artificial locomotion. IRL you isn't actually walking, but in-game you is. Now that I've gotten all of that out of the way, I will start on what I think would be criminal if I did not get into, which is one of the most important design considerations that any VR game designer has to take into account, which is VR sickness. Fancy science term for this is ocular vestibular mismatch. That happens when, to your eyes, it looks like you're moving, but the vestibular system, so the sensors that relate to the fluid inside of your inner ear, feels like you aren't moving. And those two systems of your body having a mismatch can freak out your brain, and that can result in nausea or headaches. Not a good time. Some people can develop tolerance to VR and sort of reduce their likelihood of getting motion sickness, or VR sickness. I might as well be specific about that. But there are, in general, things that you as a designer really ought to do to combat that, because the worst thing I think you could possibly do as a VR game designer is make a game that makes the people who play it sick. That's just not okay, but that's a thing we have to worry about now. So, for example, I think if there's any one point that I would want to harp on the most, it is do not spin the camera outside of the rotation of the player's head. That is a one-way ticket to Peak Town, and it's not fun. You should not do that. Some people have a tolerance to that sort of smooth rotation, they call it, but I don't. Maybe I could try to build up a tolerance, but I don't really feel like playing a game that makes me sick to my stomach. So as I mentioned, designs of your game can mitigate this problem that you might otherwise have. For example, FOV limiters, as are demonstrated. Well, you can't really see, unfortunately, in this picture at the bottom, which is out of Resident Evil 7, but you can see from this picture up here. I won't attempt to explain the neuroscience behind how this works. All I know is that it does work. If you black out the corner of the player's peripheral vision, that reduces their symptoms of VR sickness. Perhaps that's because their brain sort of gets taken out of everything by seeing this black ring around you. You know that you aren't actually there. Not entirely sure, but we use systems like this in our game. Any time when the player is moving very swiftly, or if they're dropping something like that in the game, it's sort of a comfort option. People like it.
Do you mind if I do one thing real quick?
Sure, what's up?
There we go. I was suspicious of that.
Ah, all right.
Yeah, that looks a little better.
All right, so where was I? Yes, that's the first thing you can do. The other thing that you can do to prevent the ocular vestibular mismatch is just not have any artificial locomotion, because then it's, by that I mean, whenever a game like Super Hot VR or Job Simulator, if you've ever played it, there's no artificial locomotion. To move around in game, you physically walk around in your real-life play space. So since your eyes and your inner ear fluid are telling you the same thing, a chance of motion sickness from that. The last thing that you can do to mitigate those problems is make physically interactive artificial locomotion. I already defined physically interactive, so you should have a good idea of what this means. Artificial locomotion that is built in such a way that your body is kind of performing the actions that you're doing, but not exactly. So not walking around in real life to move around in the game, but maybe walking in place in real life to move around in the game. Tricks your brain a little bit more into thinking that maybe it's actually doing what it looks like it's doing, and that can alleviate VR sickness in some people. So the first sort of class of things that I want to talk about is what I've seen studying these games of designers sort of sticking to conventions and old ways. If there's one sort of in the title of the talk, VR is a new medium and it needs to be treated as such. And you can't just take stuff from flat games and throw it right into VR and expect it to work. So here I elaborate on that a little bit. Firstly, VR makes designers rethink movement. That might seem kind of strange, but on a conceptual level, think about it. So many games are about moving a character throughout a space. Can any of you name a popular game from the last 5 or 10 years that isn't about moving a character throughout space? Anybody? I got nothing. Yeah?
I was thinking that a lot of light gun games have that type of
piece?
Yeah, you're right. There is, I mean, I think the third or fourth one had that, but for the first one, you're totally right. I can't believe I forgot about that. That is a popular game, not about moving a character through outer space. But the point is, you really have to struggle to come up with an example of a game that isn't about moving a character through space. It's so ubiquitous in all of video games, to the point that the Sega Genesis was sold by a game whose selling point was our character moves throughout his space cooler than the way your character moves throughout his space. And it permeates through the industry to the point where modern video game controllers are built for moving characters throughout 3D spaces. Traditionally, the left analog stick, as I'm sure 98% of you all know, moves your character, and the right analog stick moves the camera. Controllers are built for this functionality. It's that common. But as you'll see in a moment, as I explained, movement that is natural in flat games might not feel so natural in VR games, especially when it comes to walking or sanicking your way through everything. So, I've taken to calling this the problem of walking, because I think that's very simple and to the point. As I mentioned, walking is rather ubiquitous in flat games as a method of locomotion. I know I've been using that adjective a lot, I'm going to keep using it because it fits here really well. But walking becomes a problem when you want to use it in a VR game because there is limited IRL walking space that the player has. Until we get to the point where everyone is playing VR from laptops and backpacks in empty airplane hangars, this will continue to be a problem. The player has a bounded space in which they are able to walk around in real life. Second thing that causes this problem is that normal control inputs for games based on walking are not physically immersive. Pushing an analog stick up with your left thumb does not feel like walking. I don't think I really need to elaborate on that very much. It's not physically immersive, and as a result of that, there's the potential for VR sickness, because you get that ocular-vestibular mismatch. Now, there are creative partial solutions to this problem, but none of them are perfect. For example, if any of you guys are interested in VR game design, I strongly recommend checking out this game called Freedom Locomotion VR. It is basically a showcase in creating several different physically immersive walking systems. But it's not perfect. It has a very long setup. Basically, you put the headset on, and it asks you to walk, run, and jog by swinging your arms and walking in place like that. So you're going to look like an idiot if you do it, but you already got a big headset strapped on your face anyway. What difference does it make? So it is physically immersive, but there's a long calibration time, and there's a certain degree of imprecision to it. If you want to walk forward just 6 inches in this game, you have to think exactly how much head bob and arm swing means I walk forward 6 inches. But in a game like Resident Evil 7, you just push the analog stick forward real quick and you're good to go. It's a lot more precise. Other partial solutions to the walking problem are things like the Omni. It's kind of like a treadmill, but that thing doesn't actually move. So it attempts to be physically immersive, but it has some problems. Firstly, it's stupidly expensive. No one wants to pay like $1,200 just to not get motion sick in their VR games. But it's also kind of awkward and unnatural. I don't know about you guys, but I don't walk like this by scraping my feet against the ground, and that's how this thing works. You have low friction shoes that you sort of scrape against the bottom while you're moving. I don't know if the camera can see that, I think you get the idea. So it feels like walking, but it still doesn't quite feel like walking. So you're really just trading one problem for another. And as such, I think it's a rather imperfect solution. So the reason why I bring these up is to simply say that walking in VR doesn't always work, if that makes sense. Another thing that I want to talk about in VR games that I saw when I was checking a lot of them out is that they have a very backwards approach to menu design. When the medium of your game is a rectangular two-dimensional screen, having a menu be something like this that has options, well, it's a little pixely, but having something that you scroll through the option by option with a cursor using an analog stick makes sense. But virtual reality is supposed to be about physical interactions with virtual objects, and you have an entire third spatial dimension to work with. So why would you make a menu like this when you could make a menu like this? that is the, I want to call it a screen, but that's not even accurate. This is the title area of Job Simulator. You go into here, you pick a cartridge off the shelf that has the name of the level you want to play, you put it into that cartridge slot, and you pull that little lever, and you're teleported to the level. I don't even think I need to explain why I think that makes perfect sense for VR. This is physically immersive, it's fun. You couldn't do this before. So I get a little mad when I see designers of VR games doing old menus like this, and you could have new menus like this, because VR is this awesome new medium, and you can do cool things like this that you couldn't do before. So do cool things in your VR games. Secondly, I want to talk, oh, you got a question?
I've seen some flat games, like Surgeon Simulator, that use an interactive menu as well, where using a hand on screen to physically move stuff, so it is possible to do it in regular games.
That is a good point. Perhaps I've just never played a game like that. Well, I think Crash Bandicoot had something like that, where rather than selecting the menu, rather than selecting your level on the menu, you would like walk onto a pressure plate that would change the portal to the level, and then you would walk into it. But, so you're right, but I think my point still stands that VR is about interactions, and this is a much more fun, engaging interaction than this is.
The other thing is, reading is difficult in VR because of resolution often.
That is true.
Especially when like text on that would be hard to read in VR, not just on the screenshot.
Well, I think that's just this screen. When I use this for the PowerPoint, I was able to read it. So, but you are right. Sometimes in VR, low resolution becomes a problem, especially if you have text that isn't well anti-aliased and it's right in front of your face. So, point stands. And now I will go into the next segment, sort of general class of things that I want to talk about. Virtual reality has lots of limitations and restrictions on you that you as a designer have to abide by if you don't want your game to feel clunky. Firstly, there's different tracking methods. Making a cross-platform VR game is not easy because you have to make your game work on all of these different kinds of hardware. And this is only the so-called high-end VR hardware, so stuff that has 6 degrees of freedom and motion-tracked hand controllers. Firstly, the Vive has native 360 tracking, so out of the box it has the best capabilities of the bunch. You can spin around, you can walk in your play space, it's all going to be totally fine. Oculus Rift has optional 360 tracking if you buy a third sensor and set it up around you, but by default it is only front-facing. So right off the bat, if you want to make a game, for the Vive, it's not always easy to port it straight to the Rift, because if it's a game that involves the player spinning around in real life, you can't always do that in a game. If the sensors are facing this way, and I spin around and put my hands behind my body, the sensors can't see it, now the game doesn't know where my hands are. So you have to make those sorts of design considerations. And lastly, the PSVR, which has the largest market share out of any of these 3 headsets, is only front-facing, and it has a less accurate tracking technology, so there's a little bit more latency. Sometimes if the lighting in your room isn't perfect, you can sort of get that like head bobbing like you're on a boat sort of thing going on, which isn't super comfortable when that happens. And lastly, there can be some sort of iffy rotational tracking of the move controllers. I won't pretend that I know the science or the technology behind it, but these controllers are rotationally tracked by the sensors. But since the PSVR uses LED tracking, that camera doesn't determine the rotation of the controllers. Their rotation is determined by an internal accelerometer. And as a result of that, your rotation may sometimes be off. Secondly, if the different tracking methods weren't bad enough, you also have to deal with different input devices. The Vive Wand, as people call it, has a touchpad, 1 trigger, 2 grip buttons on the side that are mapped to the same input. Sort of imagine the PS4 controller has 2 buttons on it that are called X, one right next to each other. They just did that so the controllers could be ambidextrous. And there are no face buttons, which can get a little awkward. PSVR Move controller has no trackpad, no analog sticks, 5 face buttons, and 1 trigger, which is on the back, so you can't quite see it there. The Rift, they call it the touch controller, these motion controllers, I think personally is the best out of the bunch. Has an analog stick, 2 triggers, and 2 face buttons. So the point is, if you design your game for one of these controllers and you want it to work on the other platform, you have to consider what the input methods of your game are going to be on these different platforms. If you make a game for the touch controller that uses the analog stick to walk around, you can sort of fake it on the Vive by touching the trackpad in the direction you want to walk. So it can kind of work like an analog stick, but it feels a little clunky. But the PSVR's Move controller doesn't have anything like that at all. So you have to get much more creative if you want to have walking of that form in your game. Next, I just sort of broadly call these hardware limitations. The first problem, which is omnipresent in VR game development, is that VR is incredibly performance intensive. You have to output 2 video sources at 90 frames per second, and at least on the Rift and the Vive, you don't benefit from any sort of frame rate smoothing. If your game ever dips below 90 frames per second, the headset cuts the frame rate in half straight to 45 FPS, which feels really bad in VR, until you recover, and then it goes back to 90. So if needing to maintain 90 was bad enough, we don't get a break. We always have to be over 90 or else the player's going to notice. Secondly, this sort of gets into a broader topic that I'll go into in just a second on the next couple of slides. And it might not seem like it is a problem, but bear with me, you'll see what I'm talking about. Only the player's head and hands are motion tracked. That, and that are the only things that interact with the tracking sensors for the VR technology. You may be thinking, well, duh, of course only the head and hands are motion tracked, but I constantly see designers including systems in their games that try to pretend like they can know where the player's body is, but you can't. You can try to guess, but your guess will always be wrong sometimes. And I get into that in the next couple of slides when I talk about some specific VR design problems. Here's the first one. I named it. Oh, no, that's the other one. Okay, first one. I already mentioned what I mean by the uncanny valley of X, so let us talk about the uncanny valley of physical interactions. This emerges for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there is no haptic feedback in VR outside of controller buttons. I can't make you feel what your character would realistically feel if you were doing the thing in VR, or what am I trying to say? Yeah, like if you push your hand onto a wall in game, there's nothing pushing back on your hand. You don't feel that. You get hit by something, you don't feel it. Until we get Ready Player One style full haptic bodysuits, this will continue to be a design problem. Secondly, as I mentioned a little bit in that wall example, players can't be stopped from moving IRL even if it would logically make sense in game. If I were in VR and this were a VR table, and I would be able to push my IRL hands straight down, even though realistically you can't put your hand through a table in real life. So there's nothing to stop the player from doing that. So you have to consider these sorts of things when you build any physical interactions into your VR game. And these two data points combine to form this problem, with the fundamental issue being that your immersion is broken when you have a physical interaction in a VR game that lacks physical feedback that is fundamental to how that interaction would go in real life. Okay? So the examples that I use for this is that shooting a gun feels good, swinging a sword doesn't feel good. I should rather say that it's not that the swinging of the sword feels good, but swinging the sword into something doesn't feel good. Shooting a gun in VR manages to fall outside of the bounds of the uncanny valley of physical interactions because there isn't anything fundamental to shooting a gun that you're lacking. You feel something in your hand, IRL, the controller, you aim it as you would a gun, you click a trigger on the thing to fire the gun as you would on a gun, all makes sense. There's some light physical feedback that you aren't getting. For example, your controller doesn't weigh several pounds and there's no recoil when you fire the gun. But I would say that those are more minor physical aspects of handling a handgun as opposed to feeling like you're holding one and actually aiming it. Now granted, it's very difficult to define exactly at what point a physical interaction is fundamental, but so I'm hoping that I can keep that a little gray and that you'll all bear with me on that. So to make it more apparent what I'm talking about, let me describe why swinging a sword into something in VR doesn't feel good. Swinging a sword around by itself feels all right. It is moving with your hand as you would expect it to, even though it's weightless, no big deal. But to me, the immersion breaks as soon as you swing that sword into something. In real life, if I were holding a sword and I swung it into this table, 1, I wouldn't be able to push my sword through the table. 2, my hand and my body would feel some sort of physical force when I struck the table. And both of those things, you know, that one and that one, are conspicuously lacking in this interaction. And as such, you sort of get taken out of it. Your brain knows this isn't real because in real life, when I hit something, I feel some sort of physical force to this interaction. And when there's something like that that is fundamental to the interaction that isn't there, it breaks the player's immersion. This is why I don't like it when I see games that are trying to be VR gladiatorial combat or something like that. Because unless you get really clever with your design, swinging your melee weapon into something just won't feel good. Secondly, now bear with me here because I'm going through all of these examples for a reason. I've played lots of VR shooter games and they all have a lot of them have what I have described as the holster problem. The idea is I'm playing a VR game. I want there to be holsters on the player's hips so that they can put their gun into if they don't want to hold on to it. Sounds simple. But as I mentioned, as a result of only the player's head and hands being motion tracked, there will always be a use case in which your holsters will be in the wrong spot relative to the player's IRL body. So let me elaborate just so you can understand what I'm talking about. Let's say you want to maintain the rotation, meaning if I'm in real life and there's holsters on my hips and I swing my body to the left, they are still on my hips. I swing my body to the right, they're still on my hips. But you can't motion track the player's body, you can only motion track the player's head. So let's decide for a second that I want to have the holster's rotation parented to the rotation of the player's head in game. So as demonstrated by this figure, as soon as I do this, my holsters are not here and here, but here and here, because they are relative to the direction that I'm facing. And now there's a mismatch. And I have to think about what direction I'm looking rather than just touching my hips. The other possible case would be to have the holsters always face forward, just sort of locked in space, not being mapped with where my head is looking. But then you get the problem if I ever spin my body around to the side in the game, now the holsters are in the wrong spot. Same sort of problem exists with maintaining position. If you parent the holsters to your head, they will be in the wrong spot relative to your body if you are ever not standing straight up. If I do this, my holsters are no longer on my left hip and on my right hip. They're on my right hip and like 2 feet off of my right hip, and that's another physical mismatch. Same thing if you want to have the holsters locked in space. It works if I'm standing here, but if I ever step to the side, my holsters are no longer on my body. They are here and here because they don't move. Now, the reason why I went through all of this nonsense with you is to show that designers try to be clever and design solutions around these tracking limitations, but no matter how you try to approach this problem, there will always be a use case in which what you're going for doesn't actually line up with the player's body. No matter how you approach the rotation or position, there will always be some situation in which the holsters will be in the wrong place. No matter what you do, you lose. It's just a truth to VR game design. I don't know who said this, but this is a very good example of the only winning move is not to play. It's not going to work no matter how you approach it, so just don't try to do it. Or try to do it in some other completely different but very clever way. The other problem I call the lever problem. This is a good example of those limits on physical interactions in VR that I was talking about. And it is caused by the fact that an object like a lever, a Minecraft reference for you, is constrained. It can't move wherever it wants, it can only move about an axis. But the player's hand doesn't have those restrictions. In real life, if I grab something like this table, I can't push my hand this way. But in VR, nothing is stopping me from being able to do that. So you have to consider that when you build these sorts of systems. So for example, what happens if you grab a lever and you pull your hand away? You can see in this game, this is a clip from a YouTube video of a game called Wilson's Heart. They have an interesting approach to this problem that preserves hand presence, but still doesn't get around the fundamental problem of clunky physical interaction with a VR object. you can see that they attempt to remedy this problem by having two sets of hands whenever you grab something like this that has constrained physics. There is the solid hand, which you see first, that sort of represents realistically where your hand would be if it were real life and you were grabbing this thing. But also a second set of what I've just called the ghost hands. I don't know if there's an official title for this or not, but that's what I'm calling it. That shows you where your motion tracked in-game IRL hand situation is. So I think this is interesting from a design standpoint because they solve the problem of hand presence, but this doesn't get around the fundamental issue that this is inherently an unsatisfying physical encounter. When you grab that lever, it does not feel like you are grabbing a lever. You can move your hand however the hell you want, there's nothing stopping your motion. It doesn't feel like, well, reality. After all, that's why it's called virtual reality. It's supposed to feel like it's real, and that is not at all how levers feel in real life. So they had one potential solution. I think the better solution is just don't use levers. Build your physical interactions in VR in line with the limitations of the medium. Don't try to do something like this because you're always going to get a clunky physical interaction that leaves the player feeling very unsatisfied. Now, to sort of close out this talk, I want to go into a case study. Now, I'll say up front, I have very mixed opinions on Skyrim VR. I really like this game. I've put like 30 or 40 hours into it, but I can't pretend that it isn't a seriously flawed virtual reality game, however fun it may be. And it sort of drives home a lot of the problems that I've already talked about so far, which if you've been paying attention, you'll see all these and go like, oh yeah, that is kind of bad. So firstly, there's melee combat in this game that involves swinging weapons, and as I've already mentioned, that is an unsatisfying physical encounter because you feel like you're smashing a mace into a skeleton's face. It just feels like you're swinging a weightless hand around and it clips through everything. Walking is also the main locomotion method of this game.
Is there vibration in controllers?
There is vibration of the controllers.
So does it feel...
But it's, you know, my hand buzzing does not feel the same thing as smoothing my hand down on the stage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the immersion.
It's the next best thing, and it sort of clues you into that something is happening, but it just doesn't feel the same. So, yeah, as I said, walking is the main locomotion method of this game as it's running, so you get all those problems that I described before. Talking about the well, in this case study, I'm talking about the PSVR version of this game because up until like several days ago, that was the only version of this game. So since this is a game on the PSVR, as I mentioned, the PSVR Move controllers have kind of iffy rotational tracking sometimes, so that becomes a problem when you have a game like this where anything involving spell casting projectiles requires you to aim your spell at something. And your in-game controller being 5 degrees off doesn't seem like it's that bad, but when you're trying to shoot something at a frost troll that is making a beeline for you and is 50 yards away from you, that 5-degree difference means you might miss. And it also means you have to take that into account, so it's clunky, is what I'm trying to say. You can't just aim, you gotta try to aim and then be like, oh wait, my controller's off a little bit, let me adjust, and then shoot. And that's not super immersive to have to worry about technical problems like that. Lastly, and this could be a talk in and of itself, is the graphics of this game are really, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. This requires a second to describe it. I think it's very important because it drives home what I was talking about before of knowing the limitations of your input devices for your platform. To play this game with the Move controllers, which, I mean, is the way you probably should be playing this game. It's VR, you want to see your hands in VR. Since the Move controllers don't have touchpads or analog sticks, they have to get clever with how they handle walking in-game. And you do that by taking your non-dominant hand, which for most of us is our left hand, point it in the direction you want to walk, and hold down the thumb button on it, and you will walk in that direction. But that is not the only thing mapped to the left hand's rotation. Anything you do in-game that involves aiming something with your left hand is running at the same time as that, what direction am I trying to walk in? So, for example, I find this screenshot from the game rather hilarious because if this troll were walking at me, I would be making a beeline backwards while shooting at him as quickly as I can. But you can't aim a lightning spell forward while walking backwards because stealth aiming and walking are both determined by the direction your left hand is pointing in. So that's really clunky, and it sucks, and you shouldn't have to worry about that because it's a strict downgrade from the non-VR version of the game, or even playing the game without the Move controllers and just playing it with a normal DualShock 4 controller. It's unfortunate, and I think the best way to describe it is that it just doesn't quite work. You know, you can, if there's one point to drive home about this game in general, it is that this is a mishmash of all of these systems of flat games that just don't work in VR. You can't take a game made not for VR and throw it in VR and expect it to somehow work. Because as I just described to all of you several minutes ago, you have all of these design restrictions, technical restrictions, hardware restrictions that you have to think about and build your game with that in mind. This point that I sort of skipped over while ranting there for a minute is that if all of this physical interaction with the game were bad enough, the graphics also look kind of bad too. Skyrim is not built for VR, so you see things like you know, people that have very high triangle counts on models because they want to look realistic, and these big, open, lush environments with foliage. Foliage? Thank you. There's all this foliage everywhere that you have to render, so you can't benefit from occlusion culling. If you build your VR game inside of a series of small, boxed-in environments, you can spend all of your GPU power making a person that looks really good. But if you don't do that, and you're also out in an open environment trying to render all these trees and mountains and whatnot, you don't get that. What am I trying to say? Rendering things is not free, and if you want to render a bunch of stuff, you can't have anything that looks especially good. So rather than having a game where they build within the restrictions of VR and spend their GPU time appropriately to make a couple things look good and sort of mask everything else, you get a game where it just looks like the graphics on everything were cranked down to the point until it was able to run at 90 frames per second on a PlayStation 4, which is rather unfortunate. When you're walking around, the LODs on everything are so bad that the eyes on characters' models LOD away when you walk like 4 feet away from them, and it's a little freaky. But they had to do that because otherwise the game wouldn't work. So this is a rather interesting case study in you can't just take a game not in VR, throw it in VR, and hope that it's going to work, because it's not going to work. It's going to turn out like it is, and it's going to be clunky, and it's not going to be the best VR experience that it otherwise could be. So I want to get into the takeaways of everything. If you haven't been paying attention and you are a VR designer, pay attention now. Firstly, immersion is king. It's called virtual reality. It's supposed to feel like you're there. I think player immersion should be on the forefront of any designer's brain when trying to make anything in their game. Secondly, VR is its own animal. That's the reason why I went through all of these restrictions that you have to worry about. VR is special and you have to treat it as such, because if you don't, you're going to have a bad time. Secondly, the whole example about walking, mechanics that are ubiquitous in flat games may not work right in a VR game. You have to think with the medium in mind. And I didn't touch on this too much, but I think I'll just throw it out here because I didn't really have any other place to put it. But human biology is now a variable in your game's design where it wasn't quite as much before. For example, if you have a game that's about reaching out to touch things, a player with very long arms will have an easier time doing anything. A player with really short arms might not be able to reach something they're supposed to reach, and now they are unable to enjoy your game the way it's supposed to be enjoyed. These are now things that you have to worry about. And if there's any one takeaway that all of you can take from this talk, please design within the limitations of VR. If I had to boil down this talk in one sentence, that's the sentence right there. Know what you're doing, know what your restrictions are, work inside of them, not outside of them. And finally, I would be mad to not throw some shameless self-promotion at the end of this. We will be demoing our game. I'll set that up right after the talk is finished. And It's a VR climbing game inspired by classic 2D platformers. I love it. Launched on itch.io on Friday. Kindly take a look. Perhaps I should have put the link up there, but if you want, Taro, I can throw that link to you guys or whatever. If you wouldn't mind publicizing that in the TVGS, that would be just swell. And you can, if you want, see some of my solutions to the design problems that I've talked about. I'm very careful in building all of the parts of this game to take these restrictions in mind, seeing all the things in VR games that I thought were clunky, and designing around them. So that could be a little fun if any of you were design-minded fellows. And lastly, send me your Unreal developers. We are looking to fill a full-time developer position. If you know anyone who's good at Unreal, is willing to take a startup level wage with some little juicy company equity, and preferably has worked in VR before, please have them contact me. That would be awesome, because they've got a job waiting for them. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you all for listening. This is the Q&A portion.
No questions from Twitch. I'm looking at the Twitch screen and I'm telling you that there's no questions.
Yeah, there's no questions on that chats. So,
Any questions in here?
How soon, if at all, do you see those limitations changing?
A lot of that is dependent on the hardware, because as I mentioned, like with motion tracking, you have to know what parts of the player you can know where they are and only use that information. So those problems will go away if the hardware gets better. If we ever get a common, the holster problem could be solved if people just had a motion track belt with a sensor on the front of it and we knew what direction it was facing, because now we know the direction of the player's body. And just like that, the problem goes away. But not every home consumer has access to something like that, so you can't build your game assuming people will have that. And also, the average consumer doesn't want to shell out $90 for a hardware peripheral to play a $30 or $40 game, so you have that problem as well.
Is there a reason you couldn't just take away the holster completely? Like, do kind of the cartridge thing from the other example, like pick up the weapon or set it down or whatever?
You certainly could. That's more of a question for the individual game, because our game doesn't have hip holsters because we're not a shooter game. So I guess I can't really explain that in depth with an example, because our game isn't an example of something.
No, I
like
was
that.
just saying, so that's a possible solution.
It certainly would be. Just know that having holsters like that won't work, so get creative and try to do something else.
There it is. Top left.
Yeah.
Down, down, down.
I just said in my
Thank
description.
And with the aim problem you mentioned with the spells and whatnot, does it still break the immersion if you just throw a lot of aim assist in there?
That would actually be a decent problem, because knowing that your player's hand rotation could just sometimes be off for no good reason, I think having some sort of aim assist would be a good solution to that problem. And sort of, especially if it's spell casting, as long as it's not egregious where I'm aiming here and it's locking me onto the thing there. If it's a couple of degrees, that would be a half-decent solution to the problem. Yes.
One thing you mentioned is speed. I think that's one of the things that I noticed with VR games is that when they try to port flat games to VR, the player is moving too fast. And that creates part of the sickness or part of the sense of you're moving way too fast compared to reality. Whereas I think, so I've had experiences in VR where I'm using an analog stick to move my body around, but I'm moving much slower, and there's not a lot of, you don't get sick as easily when you're moving at a more human speed or even slower, where you can adjust to what's happening. You can imagine they're almost like some kind of, I think it's the sense of speed where when you're accelerating, you're changing speed rapidly. Like you're doing a lot of action games where you're stopping and jerking this way and that way. your body expects that force, whereas it's a very slow, gradual thing. It's almost like being in a automatic chair where you're slowly accelerating and you can sort of deal with that mentally rather than like one of the first games I supported VR was Team Fortress 2, which is a first-person shooter where you're running and jumping around everywhere. So extremely high jumping, fast movement, twitchy stuff with analog sticks. Just has that sense of the body's not moving, but you're jerking and swinging that way.
I think you make a good point, and that definitely goes to something that I've noticed. I can't say if this is true of everybody, this is sort of a personal anecdote, but when I play a VR game that involves walking, I always prefer the movement speed to be as slow as possible without gimping me within the context of the game. So in Skyrim VR, it's about walking around. I crank that movement speed down slow enough for it to be comfortable, but not so slow that I'm at a disadvantage in combat situations because I'm moving along at a snail's pace. But the anecdote that I have is when I'm in a VR game that involves walking, and you walk very quickly, I sort of get this tunnel vision. Maybe it's sort of my brain compensating for what seems like I'm moving really quickly, but feels like I'm not moving fast at all. And my immersion sort of gets broken, and I get sort of tunnel vision focus on the point that I'm moving to, but I'm not actually taking in any of the visual information about the stuff that's walking by me. So I don't know if that compares to other people, but that's certainly something I've noticed, and I think that runs antithetical to the point of VR in the first place. If you're making the player move so quickly that they get tunnel vision and they're not seeing what's around them and feeling like they are there, you have done the player a disservice as a designer. Yep.
That's very interesting because I know Eagle Flight had a lot of design constraints that they had to put in because of the big fast. You're flying through, you're an eagle flying through some of our cities and cities south. They're a restaurant company. And they put up, so the issue is you're more likely to get, so it's just general motion sickness problems that they're trying to deal with where, first of all, like you're saying, jerk is definitely a huge problem. It's not even necessarily acceleration. If you can get the acceleration smooth, is the change in the jerk force is what will cause people, like anyone to get motion sick. The other thing too is that your peripheral vision will make you more affected by motion sickness, especially if something is like close to you over here, like if you're near a wall. I guess that's why they put in blinders effectively, so that if you get close to something, that will.
Oh, is the idea?
And that's why when you're driving, like if you get motion sick in the car, you're supposed to look straight ahead because you're supposed to focus on what's in front of you and not what's to the sides, because that's what will cause you to get motion sick.
So is the idea that what seems like relatively to be a very high velocity thing, because it's something quickly moving really far away from you, is moving a big distance in your field of vision. So having something that sort of whizzes right by your face really quickly sort of freaks you out and makes you feel like you're moving really quickly as it calls
so,
motion.
and then the other thing that they put in was because you can crash into buildings or walls or whatever. And so if you go straight to a black screen, that's like hitting a black wall. And so that was very jarring and uncomfortable for players. So what they did is even if you end up, you crash, it's like game over screen, they'll still have white things flying at you. And that is enough that it broke the motion sickness uncomfortableness that a lot of players would experience.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And then frame rate. Don't let your frame rate drop.
Yeah, because when you're the frame rate, again, games that aren't optimized for VR and have the graphic size too high or whatever, like when you're moving your head, you'll sense the lag of everything's jerking.
Oh yeah, it's bad.
It creates the same juddery motion, even if you're just rotating your head, it's juddery, it still feels like it makes you feel sick, even if it's just your eyes sensing that judderiness.
Yeah, Khalil will tell you, we tried to play Onward when it was in a free weekend several months ago, and it was, I don't know if there were graphic settings that I didn't know how to turn down, or if the base specs for the game were more than what my machine had, but I was not having a good time playing that game. The frame rate was bad, everything was choppy. I I tried to play as long as I could, but I just had to rip my headset off and then lay down on my couch for 20 minutes to get back to normal. It's not fun. Don't recommend it.
Even though a lot of these games have what looks like really bad graphics compared to like a flat game, when you're in the 3D world, if it's smooth and like you said with all the immersion things, it doesn't really matter as much that the textures aren't super realistic or the polygons aren't as high as they could be, as long as I've seen some really low setting games where it still feels like you're there and you get the presence even with lack of quality.
I completely agree. I think no game is a better example than that with super hot VR. Everything is a white room and there's super low triangle count red dudes who fire bullets at you. And it's one of the best VR games ever made as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't look realistic, but the physical immersion is incredible because you're actually dodging around, trying to avoid bullets. Whenever I play that game, I would often be like leaning on the floor around shots, trying to pick people off or something crazy like that. Feels great. So, but yes, player comfort is far more important than the visual style, which if you want to check out our game, you'll see that I believe at least that having stylized visuals is the best thing to do if you can't have realistic visuals. And realistic visuals in VR is really hard to pull off because of the demanding performance requirements. So if you can't have something that looks like you're actually on a mountain, have it look really interesting and stylized instead, as Super Hot proves and as we try to do in our game. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you went over this throughout the presentation. I was busy taking photos. Platforms. Are there anything that is very specific to certain platforms or control schemes that you think you're not able to add into the presentation?
I mean, I went over the
For example, like mobile.
Yes, I haven't done any mobile VR development, but that is another example of something that has even worse restrictions placed on it. Not only is the player's head not positionally tracked, but your processing output is far worse. You normally don't want to have dynamic shadows in high-end VR, but there's no way in hell you're going to be able to have dynamic shadows on a mobile VR application. Control inputs are exceptionally limited to the point where often the only input mechanism you can assume the player will have is just being able to look at things. And it's really hard to make a game that isn't something like a simple sliding puzzle with your only control input being looking at something until a meter fills up and then the action happens. Now, I can't really say too much more about it than that because, as I mentioned, I've never done mobile VR development, but I have played a couple of mobile VR games, if you can call them games, and they're just, it's hard to make them exciting given the strict, extreme limitations placed on them. Yeah?
Given that you spent a lot of time developing for VR, with the second generation of units currently seemingly on the horizon, what would be your most biggest wish list type item for the new generation of VR hardware?
Oh my, I would love for there to be a standard, like I mentioned, just a little belt with a sensor on it that tells me the direction the player's body is facing. That solves so many VR design problems you have no idea. That would be incredible. I would also love to see, just for the mainstream viability of VR, I would love to see a headset. Imagine you took the Oculus Rift and you made it wireless and standalone, so it doesn't have to run on a computer, and bring its total price point to around $300 or $400. And you're going to see VR explode. The closest thing to that at the moment is a headset called the Pico Nano, which is very similar to the Oculus Rift. It's a standalone, high-end 6 degrees of freedom VR headset that is wireless, but it costs $800. So the technology exists, but it can still be a little clunky in places, and it's still too expensive. So I guess as a businessman, I would love to see something like that. As a designer, I would want to see headsets with the craziest high pixel density resolution possible. Give me all of the input methods. Give me full player body haptic suits. That's what I would want to see as a designer, because that's when you really get to stretch the reality part of virtual reality. But that will not fall within the cost point that an average consumer is willing to bear anytime soon.
I was wondering if verbal cues would be an option as for controls on mobile, since you have nothing else.
You mean using the phone's microphone to?
Yeah, for your voice.
I don't know if, I wonder if that would work, because I've heard of high-end VR games doing that. I was very blown away by a demo that I saw for a PSVR game, which was sort of a like low-res horror game where you can yell into your microphone to echolocate so you can see everything around you, which is a really cool idea. But I don't know if that would work on mobile VR.
It's more common on mobile VR, seeing that having a microphone is considered standard on mobile.
So have you seen people make mobile VR games that involve verbal commands?
Well, we were trying to make one for one of the companies I worked at.
It should be feasible. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's
it would
completely
be.
feasible.
And I've seen like Oculus games that use it for commands. Like there was a experience that a couple of students made where it was about someone getting accosted by the police. They're like racial violence simulator, and it was pretty intense. And you were an innocent bystander, and you could talk to the police and tell them to like back off, or you could tell them to back off, or you could try to ignore the situation. And depending on your input, you could choose to not act as well, and depending on that would change how the thing reacted. And it was all done in video, so it was really really well done. But I haven't seen it a lot. I think just because there's not a lot of high-end VR mobile experiences. Most of them are advertising.
Yes, I've seen, I don't know what the name of it is, but I saw one experience, I guess you would call it, on the Oculus store, where the idea is you're talking to this person. I don't know if it's always a woman. I assume they gender swap it based on whatever the player wants. But you talk to this woman, and it's ultimately trying to be a romance type game where the ultimate idea is you're supposed to fall in love with this person or whatever. And the entire gameplay, if you can call it that, is just talking to this person. I haven't played it, so I can't say in much depth than that, but it is interesting to see just people exploring that idea in virtual reality. I think it's very cool.
And I think there's also there's like the Daydream, which is the Google Pixel virtual reality technology, and they do have a flicker, so it's a pointer, and that works. And I think those experiences are more game-like than a lot of the other mobile experiences. So just to talk about inputs for just in general. So it's possible that there may be a time, like I think that's the benefit of mobile VR is that it's accessible to a lot more people. It's just that right now it doesn't have the fidelity that is needed to be engaging, and maybe someday there'll be better haptic inputs for phones that will be normalized. But I think that's a general issue. Is nothing's normalized. Like Microsoft came up with their MR headsets, and you try to access Steam on that, and it's kind of a clutch trying to get from the Microsoft the XR experience into the Steam and figuring out what will actually work within that ecosystem. Even though it's supposed to support Steam, it doesn't support all of the games and stuff. So.
Yeah, that's a lot of good points there. I think to the topic of like fidelity in mobile VR, seeing something like the Oculus Go, I like seeing as somebody who's doing VR as a business, because it sort of bridges the gap between the $20 plastic headsets that you stick your iPhone into and the $1,200 buy your Rift, buy the gaming PC, do the whole thing. Because it's more like mobile VR than high-end VR, but it's mobile VR with a lot better visual fidelity and a standardized input device, which is why I think it's exciting, and at a price point that somebody isn't going to gawk at. Yeah.
So, given the issues of movement and making sure that your brain feels like it's doing something that it, you know, corresponds with the movement on screen. I'm curious to know, like, what, from your experience applying a bunch of VR games, is true of like putting the player in a vehicle, because that is a way of conveying something that doesn't involve like walking, but like on the other hand seems like it's moving the camera without doing stuff. But if like the player in the virtual world sees they're in some kind of vehicle, is that enough to like trick the brain? Or
I honestly can't say too much because I haven't played a lot of VR vehicle games. I think they can be proud. Have you played a couple?
Yeah, I was gonna say that one of the popular games that happens to support VR is Elite Dangerous, where you're in a cockpit. The problem becomes when, if again, it's just the same problem of if you're moving too fast, you can make sudden motions in your cockpit. So it's just like real life. If you were in a situation where you're being spun around like one of those carnival rides, and you're trying to like move in 360 degrees, which you're allowed to do on those spaceships. You can move all over the place. It can still be disorienting because again, it's all around you. Whereas games like driving games, where you're mostly going straight ahead, even though there is turning, you don't get that sense of. The problem becomes, and I've seen games where you're driving a car, and when the car crashes, instead of you staying in that first-person view where you're tumbling, flipping all over the place, they bring it out to a third-person view, like you're shot out of the car. You see the car tumbling, but you're just sort of, moving ahead. I think that's one way of solving the problem for a system like that. Is you're in a cockpit, which helps with the motion. You're moving straight ahead, which helps with the motion again, because you're not making those sudden turns. But then when something jarring happens, pulling you out of the first-person view into the third-person view, you're not experiencing that rapid rotation. It's one way of seeing it getting around. Again, to me, it's mostly about the speed of which things are changing around you. So, like, there's a lot of games that have you moving really fast straight ahead. You don't get sick because you're always moving in the same direction without that sudden, jarring motion.
I would say, adding on to that, I remembered a couple of vehicle-based VR games that I've played. And I think the fundamental problem that they all have is that you necessarily have to put artificial rotation into your game. If we define artificial locomotion as I'm not moving in real life, but I'm moving in game, artificial rotation is I'm staying put in real life, but I'm spinning in game. And I, at least, have exceptionally low tolerance to that. I would recommend if any of you have an Oculus Rift, I don't know if it's on Steam, but there's a free little Rift experience called Air Car, where you're just sort of in a little plane-like car that you fly around this Blade Runner-looking city, and it's really cool, and it feels really fun. But inherent to that is when you're in a vehicle, you don't spin around to decide the direction that you now want to fly in. You spin the vehicle in that direction, so you're spinning the player's camera without them moving. And as I explained, that can make people very VR sick. I tried to do a barrel roll once in Air Car, but I had to rip my headset off as soon as I was done with it. Yeah, she gets it. It was a bad time.
That's why I was saying, like, even though it ruins the immersion, player comfort sometimes is more important than just being immersed. That's why you do these tricks, pulling out from first-person view or pulling the black dot to pull you out of the experience a little bit, so that you don't get sick in those intense moments, and then you can go back to the immersion once you're in a more stable situation.
I completely agree. And I guess to revise my list of priorities, I would say comfort is number one and immersion is number two. Because I can think of one instance in our game that I deliberately break the player's immersion for the sake of the comfort. When our game has a jetpack power-up, so that if you throw yourself off the edge, if you would fall a certain distance that would otherwise kill you, we float you back up to where you fell from. And when I implemented that, I noticed that without any sort of FOV limiter, I was adjusting the position of my body to try to counteract the motion that it looked like I was having. So if I would like if I would throw myself backwards off of a handhold and then get jetpacked up and forward into it, I would kind of lean my body backwards to counteract that fake motion. And I was afraid that I would make some people fall over in real life playing the game if they did that. So I decided I was going to throw an FOV limiter around the player's viewpoint to sort of momentarily take them out of it. And as soon as I did that, I never did that leaning my body thing anymore. So I'm assuming that's true for a lot of other people as well. So just an example of where you want to be as immersive as you can, but physical safety of the player is a bit more important than immersion sometimes. What's up?
So I'm in flight sim VR, and it's very vehicular, obviously. I think having a very detailed cockpit around you, and the user base being a bit more used to the rest of it not being as high definition really helps us, fit into that market, and also grounds you. It gives you a certain anchor into something that doesn't move very strangely when you're creating world movements that are very different from where how you feel you are physically. One thing I would say is that in that case, comfort might not come first exactly. It depends on the context, but sometimes when one aspect of flight sims when they're used professionally is to basically weed out people who should not be flying an actual aircraft. So finding out whether they'd be discomforted by certain situations is actually preferred in the sim. But it really depends on the user and the use case. Most of your home flight sim users don't want to throw up.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I had never really thought of that before. I wonder, can you assume that somebody who gets VR sick playing a flight sim will get motion sick flying an aircraft?
It's not very straightforward yet. Like the research, when I was doing some research before I started this job, simulation sickness and air sickness are not necessarily one-to-one. I know that I myself actually get more simulation sickness from playing a first-person shooter on a flat first-person shooter than I do looking around VR, simply because the first-person shooter just has all that movement that doesn't correspond to what you're doing. I mean, it's on a screen, but it's still very jarring. As long as the VR game is very poorly designed, your head movements are the movements of looking around.
That's true. I've always been fascinated by people who get motion sick watching a video game with a spinning camera. I don't honestly know what the biological mechanism for that is. My mother is the exact same way, which is weird because she couldn't watch me as a kid play Spyro because of the spinning camera in it, but she's able to play our game and not get motion sick.
Yeah,
so
my experience is very similar to that.
It's very strange, yeah.
Back to the third person example, have you played any VR games that were entirely third person? Because I had a question about that.
I've played a couple that were like that, yeah.
Does, say we do one like that for the whole game, third person, how much more immersive is it in VR than if it were just to be flat?
I guess it depends what you mean by immersive. It looks like I'm there, but I don't feel like I'm physically doing anything in the game. I just sort of feel like I'm an observer that's there looking at everything. And there's ways to preserve that and not make the player motion sick. Like, I played a couple of those games. One of them was trying to be Zelda-esque. And if you can imagine like a Zelda hopping between different screens of a dungeon, the way that translated to this game in VR is that there's a fixed camera point in every room, and when you make your character walk into the next room, you, the player, appear at that camera point. There's other third-person VR games that have you be some kind of scrolling camera, but since that's artificial movement, that can make people a little bit motion sick. There was a PSVR launch title called the Playroom VR that had a cute little third-person robot mini platformer game, which I actually thought was really fun. I would totally buy it if they made that into a full game. But since that was third-person and you, the player character, was sort of this robot that was controlling the in-game, you were a robot as the player character, but you, the robot player character, was controlling another smaller robot with your controller who was doing all the running around and jumping. I hope that made sense.
How immersive was that?
It can get a little immersion breaking when you, the player character, the camera are sort of scrolling along, because that artificial movement can be a little discomforting for all the reasons that I described before.
So a good rule of thumb then, I'm guessing, is third person, stick to flat. Stick to a flat game if you're going to do third person.
I mean, you can make third-person VR games work. You just have to be careful to design around these issues of motion sickness. I think if you're going to make a third-person VR game, swapping the player between fixed camera points makes the most sense, because there's no artificial locomotion or rotation at all. So that's not even a potential problem for it. You got something to chime in?
What were we talking about before? Because I had a good example of something. Before the third person. I'll come back.
Do you have a question?
You have an example of that third person, Lucky's Tale, it's like, that where you're that camera, and it's kind of like a typical third person game where your camera follows the character.
What is it?
It's Lucky's Tale.
Okay.
And it's this little fox character, it's like a cool pretty but whenever I change direction, I'm going out in a direction where you have a character how face is seated, there's this kind of weird drag of the camera that I really like. I don't know what they're on.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. I was going to say something about the motion sickness thing. Because when VR first came out, they actually were trying to do studies to figure out why certain people would get sick and some people wouldn't. And they said that one thing that they looked at was how people process 3D differently. So some people process 3D primarily by the difference between the two eyes. So we see an object, the different perspectives of the two eyes, you can sort of tell how far away things are. So for those people, I think they tended to do better in VR because it's set up with the two screens from two different perspectives. So VR really keyed into that type of processing for people who see 3D primarily through this two-eye situation. But there's other people who see things primarily through shadowing and different, so like when you move your head, even with line, you move your head, you can see things moving in parallax. When you move left and right. So for people who see 3D primarily through shadows and the parallax motion of objects when you're moving your body around, that's a whole different way that people tend to see VR. I think that was a problem with some of the early VR stuff, is that it prioritized the two-eye perspective of seeing everything 3D, but it didn't necessarily work for people who see primarily through the shadowing and the motion in the head. Because we're talking about back when VR started, you didn't have the motion tracking, the positional tracking, you just had rotational. So for people who rely on positional, like moving your head left and right to see things in 3D better, or seeing shadowing when the shadowing is off in your game between your eyes, like you're talking about dynamic shadows. If you don't have dynamic shadows for each eye, and you just have a flat shadow that's always there and always looks the same. For those people who don't have positional tracking and don't see the shadows properly, it makes them feel more sick. Even though your dipolar with 2 eyes won't be correct. For them, it still makes them sick because they can't move their head left and right, and the shadows don't change, so it just doesn't look great.
That's actually really interesting. I wonder if that means that there's a certain, type of brain that would do better in games that don't have artificial locomotion as opposed to games that have artificial locomotion. You're supposed to be standing in place and not hopping around, looking at everything. You're not going to get that parallax telling you where things are in a 3D space.
That's one of the reasons why the early VR, like I said, didn't have, or even the mobile VR that doesn't have positional tracking, you can move your head. And the shadows are such a low quality that you might not ever change position of your head. So that's why some people can't handle the early VR stuff because they just process 3D differently and then having 2 different images.
It's really cool stuff.
That's another limitation though that people didn't get at first. The person designing the game didn't realize what was going on. Just them, everything was fine.
Yeah, and it's very hard to be a VR designer in that respect because you get so accustomed to your own game. There's the same thing that happens when you're a designer of any type of game. You know exactly how it works, so of course you're going to be really good at it. It seems like everything's easy. But in VR, you sort of I'm completely desensitized to my own game. I don't feel like I'm actually dangling over a giant pit of death. I always find it interesting to see all the different physical reactions that people get to our game. Like they get scared because it looks like they're really high up, or they have depth perception issues because they can't tell if their hand is over something or not, because I just don't have any of those problems. It's a really VR game design and watching people play your game is very interesting just to show you the sheer variety of human biology and how everybody's just a little bit different.
Do you use like a dynamic shadowing? I don't know how that works. For your game, is it, you got positional tracking, which is good.
We do. I mean, we don't have any shadows on the player. We have shadows on in-game objects, but they're all static. It's baked lighting. So, what's an example? Well, you can see the shadow on this desk coming from the light behind me, and if I move over here, the shadow adjusts. But to do that in the GPU requires a stupid amount of math, and if I only have 11 milliseconds to render a single frame, and if I'm spending 3 of those 11 milliseconds rendering 2 dynamic shadows, I'm just not going to have any dynamic shadows because I can't afford them. When you can, it's nice. There's one level in which I could afford a dynamic shadow for something that served a nice design purpose, but in general, it's just kind of not worth it. And it's a shame. I would love to have super high fidelity visuals and put dynamic shadows on everything, but modern computers just can't handle that. That's why I buy a $10,000 computer. Yeah?
You spoke a little bit about interface design and how you're not a big fan of menus, but in a lot of ways, there's hundreds of years of experience in the cultural zeitgeist of designing an interaction system or a way of perceiving information that's two-dimensional. I mean, even before games, you've got computer interfaces are almost entirely 2D, and before computers, you've got interaction with physical media is almost entirely print-based, which is on paper. So how do you find combating that in terms of designing 3D interfaces? Because it's almost, there's a little bit of overlap in researching that stuff since the 60s with computers and 3D technology, but really it's almost entirely new ground.
I would say, now granted, I'm no expert on the subject matter, but I guess just sort of take part of what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I would guess that a lot of people's familiarity with menus and traditional UI just comes from being exposed to it all and getting used to the ways that people do it and then expecting other things to work that way. There's not a lot of things if we were all still hunter-gatherers, not anything really in nature that looks like a rectangular 2-dimensional menu with options that you scroll through. But so something like the job simulator menu where you pick something up and put it into a cartridge slot and pull a lever, I think that's actually a lot more intuitive because you're performing a physical reaction rather than interacting with some sort of abstract interface. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
A lot more immersive.
In a lot of ways, it's similar to how when we first started having smartphones, the interface is very simple, but then somebody just determined that a long press is a very useful way to distinguish between the two different states of doing things.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Any other questions from anybody? Shall we get to the demo? I know you all want the demo.
I saw the demo.
We have a design.
Yeah, right there.
He doesn't even speak well yet, but he's